I remember that afternoon with a searing clarity, the afternoon the divorce papers slid across the glass table and stopped right in front of my hands, as if I were being handed a bill and not the final word on a 3-year marriage. The coffee shop was on the second floor, overlooking a wide avenue in the heart of the Upper East Side. Through the picture windows, cars packed the street under the late afternoon sun. Inside, the air conditioning hummed at a steady rhythm, and the smell of roasted coffee, mixed with the sweet perfume of the person sitting across from me, caused a bitter dryness in my throat. To my left was my husband, Mark. To his right was Lucy, my best friend for 20 years. I sat across from them, my hands on my purse, my back straight, and my gaze fixed on the sheaf of papers their lawyer had just handed me. The ink from the law firm's certification wasn't even entirely dry. Everything had been drafted in a way that was concise, clear, and mercilessly cold. The apartment on the Upper West Side, the SUV we bought last year, the savings left in our joint account, even the expensive furniture we had once chosen together with so much excitement. It was all meticulously divided in lines of black ink on white paper. Only the most important thing was missing. "Sign it, Carmen." Mark's voice sounded monotonous. It wasn't loud, but it was as hard as the glass of the table that separated us. I looked up at him. In 3 years of marriage, I had heard him use all sorts of tones. Tender, pleading, irritated, even glacial silence. But I had never heard that tone before. It was like a supervisor urging an employee to sign a delivery slip to get it over with. Lucy, sitting beside him, had her hand with its red-painted nails resting lightly on the sleeve of Mark's jacket. With her head slightly tilted, her voice was so soft that anyone who didn't know the story would think she was trying to console me out of sheer compassion. "Carmen, you can't force a heart. If your love is gone, it's better to let it go. What we have is real." I looked at Lucy, at the face that had been familiar to me since the 3rd grade, at the lips that had so often laughed and talked with me in my mother's small kitchen. I looked at the eyes that had once filled with tears as she hugged me when my father was admitted to the hospital. I no longer saw my friend of 20 years. Across from me was only a woman trying to use a gentle tone to hide the triumph gleaming in the back of her eyes. The place wasn't noisy, so the nearby tables could hear us. I knew they weren't turning to look at us directly, but their ears were alert. Their sideways glances brushed against us and then silently withdrew. Mark, impatient, drummed his fingers on the table. "I've made it very clear. The house is divided according to the law, the money is split in half. I'm not going to let you lose out. Making a scene won't do any good." I looked down at the papers once more. My hands were freezing, but my mind was strangely lucid. That lucidity hadn't come overnight. It didn't start that afternoon, or even when I discovered his betrayal. It began 3 months ago, the day Lucy showed up at my door with a cream-colored suitcase, her eyes red and her lips trembling, saying she had just broken up with her boyfriend, that she'd been kicked out of the apartment they shared, and that she had nowhere to go. That day, I was the one who opened the door for her. "Stay with us for a few days," I told her as I helped her in with the suitcase. "That's what friends are for." 3 months later, she was sitting across from me, stroking the sleeve of my husband's jacket as if it were a natural gesture, ingrained by habit. I turned to the 2nd page, then the 3rd. The clauses were still impeccable. Mark's lawyer was undoubtedly a professional. Except he didn't know everything. Or maybe he knew and had intentionally omitted it. I left the papers on the table. "I'm not signing." Mark froze for a couple of seconds. His face turned pale, then darkened. "Carmen, don't cross the line." Lucy gently squeezed his wrist and turned to me with a voice as soft as cotton. "Carmen, think about it. Clinging to someone who doesn't love you anymore will only hurt you both." I let out a laugh, not a loud one, just a short, dry sound that seemed strange even to me. "Now you're telling me that." Lucy was speechless for a moment. Mark frowned. "Don't speak in riddles. I've already made my decision." "I know," I replied, looking him straight in the eye. "And precisely because you've decided, I'm not going to sign this." Mark leaned back in his chair, watching me intently. I understood what he was thinking. He thought I would cry, that I would beg, that I would remind him of our 3 years of marriage, that I would use our parents to threaten him. He thought I would do everything a betrayed woman usually does, only to sign in helplessness at the end. But I did none of that. I took my phone out of my purse. Mark frowned. "Who are you calling?" I didn't answer, just dialed the number. On the other end, the phone rang once before someone answered. A deep, formal male voice resonated. "Hello, you've reached Alex." I stared at the 2 people in front of me and spoke each word slowly. "Alex, I need you to come to the coffee shop, please." I've decided to get a divorce, but from now on, I'm setting all the terms. Lucy's hand, which was wrapped around Mark's arm, tensed. He leaned forward. What, Alex? I hung up the phone and placed it on the table, in no hurry to respond. I picked up my glass of water and took a sip. The cold liquid ran down my throat, but inside, I felt a smoldering fire. It had been 2 weeks. I was the one who had first called Alex. It was a Wednesday, and I was supposed to fly to Chicago for a client meeting. A 3-day trip. I had my suitcase packed from the night before. In the morning, I left the house with it, as usual. Mark, still in bed, his back to me, said a familiar phrase. I went down to the lobby, waited exactly 15 minutes, and went back up. The meeting had been cancelled late last night, but I hadn't told him at the time. I just had a simple thought. It had been a long time since we'd had a nice surprise for each other. I'd come back early, buy some groceries, and cook a nice dinner. If I had warned him, maybe everything would have been different. At least I wouldn't have heard the words that made me wake up completely. I used my key to open the door silently. No one was home, except in the bedroom. The door was ajar, and from inside came the sound of a woman's laughter, then Mark's voice, and then Lucy's. They were fragmented sentences, but clear enough for me to understand my role in their story. A dull wife, a woman who only knew how to work, a fool who trusted her friend and her husband, a stepping stone for them to cross. I didn't kick the door in, I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I stood outside listening to everything, and then I went downstairs and sat on a bench in the courtyard for 3 hours. The sun was out, but my hands were freezing. I don't know what I was looking at. I only remember a leaf from a plane tree falling right on my shoe, and I watched it for a long time. Around noon, I called Alex. He was the lawyer who had been collaborating with my company for years, mainly handling civil cases and contracts. To him, I was just a regular project manager, at least on the surface. I asked him to discreetly investigate a few matters. The movements in our joint account, the purchase contract for the car Mark drove, and some documents related to the apartment we lived in. 3 days later, Alex brought me a thick file. I sat in my office, turning each page, feeling the cold seep into my body. The money from the joint savings account had been almost entirely withdrawn in small amounts and transferred to a personal account in Mark's name. The SUV wasn't a company car on loan, as he had told me, but was being paid for in installments, and the initial down payment had come from the joint account. For the last 6 months, there had been a regular monthly transfer in a woman's name. The description was sometimes help, sometimes loan, and sometimes it was blank. That woman was Lucy. And that wasn't all. The apartment we lived in was legally in my name only. The money to buy it was a gift from my parents before the wedding. The monthly mortgage was also paid from my personal account. Mark had only been in charge of taking the money to the bank a few times. And over time, he started telling everyone it was a house we had built together. I never paid much attention to it. I thought that in a life together, you didn't need to keep track of those things. Now, I understood that sometimes it's not about keeping score, but that some people are silently keeping score against you, day after day. Carmen. Mark's voice brought me back to the present. I'm asking you one last time. What are you planning to do? I placed both hands on the table, lacing my fingers together to keep them from shaking. I looked at him and then at Lucy. That's a question I should be asking you. Lucy bit her lip, trying to maintain a serene expression. Carmen, don't complicate things. Let's put everything in its place. Yes, everything in its place, I nodded. Well, today we're going to make everything clear. Just then, the coffee shop door opened. A man in his 40s in a white shirt, carrying a black leather briefcase, walked in, accompanied by a young assistant. He walked quickly, scanning the room until his eyes settled on our table. Mark turned to look, and Lucy did the same. I saw their expressions change almost in unison. Alex stopped by the table, gave me a slight nod, and then pulled out a chair to sit down. The assistant placed another perfectly organized file in front of him. Sorry, I'm 5 minutes late, he said. I shook my head gently. It's fine. Mark looked from Alex to me, his eyes starting to show unease. For the first time in months, I felt my heart calm down a bit, not because the pain had disappeared, but because I knew that from that moment on, they were no longer in control of the game. Slowly, I pulled the divorce papers toward me. I turned to the last page and looked up at the man who had been my husband. You want a divorce? Fine, I said. But before I sign, we're going to recalculate every penny, every document, and every outstanding issue. Including the things you think I don't know about. Mark didn't have time to answer. Lucy's face had turned as white as a sheet of paper. And I, sitting very straight, listened to the slow, steady beat of my heart. It was as if from the ashes of 3 years of resignation, another woman was slowly rising to her feet. As soon as Alex sat down, the air at the table seemed to run out of oxygen. At the next table, you could hear the clinking of a spoon against a cup. The coffee grinder at the counter kept its steady rhythm, and the cars continued to move down the street. However, in the space that separated the four of us, I could clearly hear Lucy's breathing begin to quicken. The sweet, refined appearance she had tried to maintain had cracked into a small wrinkle next to her eyes. Mark, for his part, sat up straight, his shoulders tense. His hand, resting on the edge of the table, was no longer drumming, but his index finger moved with an almost imperceptible rhythm, one that only someone who had lived with him for 3 years could notice. Alex opened his briefcase and took out a file, slimmer than I expected. I glanced at the edges of the pages marked with colored tabs, all very organized. He didn't speak immediately. First, he addressed me with the same professional tone he used at the office. Mrs. Carmen, before we begin, allow me to confirm something. I am here at your request, as your legal representative, to protect your interests in the preparation of the divorce proceedings and the review of assets. Is that correct? Correct. I nodded. Only then did Alex turn to Mark. Courteous but firm. I am Alex, the attorney retained by Mrs. Carmen. If you have decided that the divorce is irreconcilable, I suggest that from now on, all conversation focus strictly on documents, figures, and legal grounds. That will save both parties time. Mark managed a bitter, soundless smile. Wow, you've got this all figured out, Carmen. You're better prepared than I thought. I looked at him. If I hadn't prepared, I would have already signed those papers that divide everything in half, including the things that were never yours. Lucy, beside him, shifted slightly and interjected with her usual syrupy voice. Carmen, don't be so harsh. Mark just wanted everything to be resolved amicably from the start. I turned to Lucy. You sleep together in my house, you spend the money from my marriage's joint account, and now you dare to talk to me about being amicable? Lucy's face flushed, but she quickly regained her victim-like demeanor. I know you're angry. If you want to insult me, I'll take it. But feelings? Don't talk to me about feelings, I cut her off. My voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make her stop. If this were really about feelings, you wouldn't have needed to take this path. Alex opened the file, took out the first document, and placed it in the center of the table. Let's get to the point. According to the property deed for the apartment located on the Upper West Side, the sole owner at the time of purchase is Mrs. Carmen. The down payment was transferred from an account in the name of Mrs. Carmen's parents to her personal account. Subsequently, the entire history of mortgage payments shows that the funds came from Mrs. Carmen's personal account. Once you're married, what's one person's money is both of yours, right? Mark argued. Alex's expression didn't change. Money used in marital life can be difficult to define, but the law recognizes as separate property those assets whose origin can be proven. In the case of this apartment, the documentation is quite clear. Mark turned to me, his eyes starting to glint with anger. You hid this from me. I felt a bitter laugh forming in my throat. Hid it? You've lived in that house for 3 years. You never asked me whose name it was in or what money paid for it. And now you say I hid it from you? Or is it that you only care about how much you get in the divorce? My words made Mark clench his fists. I knew he was holding back because the coffee shop was full, because a lawyer was present, because he still wanted to maintain appearances, but his face had taken on a grayish hue. The same one he had the day I showed him the photo of the car purchase contract. Alex took out another paper. Next, the vehicle currently used by Mr. Mark. The purchase agreement is in his name. The down payment of $20,000 was transferred from the couple's joint account. However, at that time, Mrs. Carmen did not sign any documents, nor did she give written consent to convert a marital asset into separate property in his name. Therefore, the money from that initial deposit must be reviewed. Lucy began to shift uncomfortably in her seat. Alex, I think there must be a misunderstanding. Mark uses the car for work, he didn't buy it for. Alex turned to her, maintaining his courtesy. Excuse me, I am working with Mr. Mark and Mrs. Carmen. You are not an interested party in this process, so I must ask you to refrain from making statements on his behalf. The sentence was as smooth as it was sharp, and it left Lucy speechless. I looked at her and saw her hands clutching the hem of her skirt. The red polish on her nails seemed increasingly garish. Mark took a deep breath and said, forcing himself to remain calm, all right. Let's say the house isn't divided, and the car issue needs to be reviewed. And the savings, according to the law, are still joint assets. Alex nodded. Exactly. And that's why everything needs to be calculated correctly. In the last 7 months, there have been multiple withdrawals from the joint account totaling nearly $50,000. Most of it was transferred to your personal account, and from there, some amounts were transferred to a third party. Without anyone needing to say her name, Lucy understood who the third party was. Her face turned ashen. Mark, for his part, slammed the table so hard that the water glass vibrated. I lent money to a friend. What's wrong with that? Lucy was going through a tough time. I looked at him slowly. A friend? Whose friend? I asked. A friend of mine, who else? A friend of mine who needs my husband to secretly transfer thousands of dollars to her. A friend of mine who lives in my house, wears my clothes, uses my things, and sleeps with my husband. I paused and looked him straight in the eyes. Go on, I'm listening. The coffee shop fell almost silent. I knew many eyes were on us, but at that moment, I no longer felt ashamed. The greatest shame had already been swallowed that morning, standing outside my bedroom door. After that, the glances of strangers were like the wind. Suddenly, Lucy burst into tears. Carmen, please, don't say those things in public. I know I did wrong, but we didn't mean to hurt you so much. I looked at her for a long time. There are faces you know your whole youth, faces you think you could recognize even with your eyes closed, but it's only when they betray you that you understand that the most familiar can also be the most false. From the moment you walked into my house with that suitcase, everything was intentional, I said in a low voice, but every word was clear. The only fool was me. For taking so long to believe it. Lucy opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Mark, by instinct, turned to her. It was a fleeting glance, but enough to see a flash of impatience. They were no longer on the same side, as firm as they had been at the beginning. That's how it usually is with those who believe they're in a position of power. As soon as their weak spot is touched, they start to look at each other with recrimination. Alex closed part of the file, his voice still measured. I'm warning you in advance, Mr. Mark. If both parties reach an agreement, everything will be much simpler. But if you insist on this draft, intentionally omitting the funds that should be returned or incorrectly declaring assets, Mrs. Carmen has every right to request the court to investigate the flow of money, the purpose of the transfers, and the use of marital assets during the marriage. Mark smiled contemptuously. Are you threatening me? No, Alex replied. I'm simply informing you of the legal consequences if the conflict escalates. Mark fell silent. I saw his Adam's apple move slightly as he swallowed. He was afraid, not afraid of losing me, that he had already discarded long ago. What he feared was losing money, prestige, control of the situation, and possibly other things he was trying to hide even more deeply. I knew this because in the file Alex had brought today, besides the house, the car, and the accounts, there was a section that hadn't been opened yet, a section related to Mark's work, with the project he planned to take to another company to get a better position. Alex hadn't mentioned it, because I didn't want him to yet. There are cards you have to hold until your opponent thinks they've seen everything. Mark remained silent for almost half a minute before speaking, his tone noticeably softer. Carmen, let's go home and talk about this in private. There's no need to make a scene. Hearing him, I just felt tired. When he prepared the divorce papers with Lucy to force me to sign, he didn't think about talking in private. When he emptied the joint account, he didn't think about negotiating. Only now, realizing that I was no longer going to stand by idly, did he remember the words, marriage and privacy. There's nothing left to talk about in private, I replied. Whatever needs to be said, let's say it here and get it all clear. Through the window, the sun had dimmed, leaving a honey-colored layer of light on the asphalt. I suddenly thought that a sunset is like a marriage. Sometimes, from a distance, it looks warm, but only when you get inside it do you discover that the light is fading. Alex pushed the divorce papers back toward Mark. You can keep this draft, but in my opinion, it no longer has any negotiating value. Mrs. Carmen's side will send you a new proposal in the coming days, along with an inventory of assets, the amounts to be reconciled, and some specific requests. When you receive it, I recommend you read it very carefully. Mark didn't pick up the papers. Lucy, beside him, no longer dared to touch his shoulder. Both of them, who had started with an aggressive and cornering attitude, were now sitting in silence, as if the slightest movement could make everything collapse before their eyes. I stood up first, my hand resting on the handle of my purse. My palms were still cold, but my steps no longer trembled. Mark, I said, looking at the man who for 3 years had been my support and whom I had trusted blindly. This is just the beginning. What you took from me through deceit, I will get back, one thing after another. And what you owe me for your betrayal, you probably won't be able to pay back in your entire life. With that, I turned around. Alex stood up to follow me. Just as I reached the stairs, I heard the sound of a chair being pushed back abruptly behind me, and Lucy's alarmed voice calling out softly, "Mark." I didn't turn around. There are affections that, once dead, are better left undisturbed. Looking back only forces you to see what's left of them. As I left the coffee shop, the afternoon wind hit my face, cool and sharp. I stopped for a few seconds under the shade of a tree on the sidewalk. Alex didn't rush me. He simply stood beside me, waiting in silence. After a while, he asked very quietly, "Are you okay?" I watched the flow of cars and felt a pang of pain in my chest, but this time the pain didn't sink me. It was like a wound that had just been cleaned. It stung, but at least it had stopped festering. "I'm fine," I replied, and after a long exhale, I added, "But I don't think this is going to be just about dividing assets, Alex." He turned to look at me, and I returned his gaze. "The part related to his work. I'll tell you everything tomorrow." The wind blew again. At the end of the alley across the street, a florist was busy tying bouquets of sunflowers. I don't know why, but that image reminded me of my mother. Whenever there was a problem at home, she didn't cry right away. She would silently start washing a dish, cleaning the table, or folding a pile of clothes. It was her way of staying grounded. No matter how much it hurt, we didn't allow ourselves to fall apart when there was still work to be done. I gripped the handle of my purse and stepped off the curb. I knew that from tomorrow on, I would be facing not only a divorce, but also the dirtiest part of Mark's personality. A part that, had I not discovered it with my own eyes, I probably would have died thinking he was just an unfaithful man, when the truth was much worse. That night, I didn't go straight home. I let Alex take me to his office, an office on the 7th floor of an old building near Central Park. The sky had completely darkened. The yellowish light from the street lamps filtered through the large windows, drawing long stripes on the tiled floor. The city was no longer as noisy as in the afternoon, but it wasn't quiet enough to ease the weight on my heart. Alex made me a cup of hot tea, placed it in front of me, and sat across from me without rushing, without insistent questions. He gave me time to breathe, to sort through the chaos in my head. I held the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth spread slowly through my palms. It was a small warmth, but enough to remind me that I was still standing. "Alex," I said after a while of silence, "the part related to Mark's work. I want you to see it." He nodded. "Go ahead." I opened my purse and took out a small flash drive. I had been carrying it with me for the past 2 weeks, ever since the day Alex handed me the first file. I didn't want to open it right away, because I knew that once I saw it, there would be no turning back. "There are files on here that I took from his computer," I said. "It's not that I was snooping on purpose. I just wanted to check an old contract, and happened to see it." Alex took it and plugged it into his laptop. The screen lit up, showing a series of neatly organized folders. He opened an Excel file, then a PDF, and his eyes lingered longer on some figures. The air in the office grew dense. I didn't need to look to know that what he was reading was not something that could be overlooked. About 10 minutes later, he looked up. His gaze was no longer as serene as it had been in the coffee shop. It was deeper, more serious. "Are you sure these files are from Mark?" he asked. "Positive," I replied. "The user account is his, and the emails inside are from his work." Alex nodded slowly. "If what's shown here is correct, the problem is no longer limited to a conflict over marital assets." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He closed the laptop halfway, as if weighing his words. "In these files, there is evidence that Mark has been transferring internal project data to a competitor. It includes budgets, client lists, and certain confidential information. If your company finds out about this, the consequences will be very serious." Hearing this, I felt my heart clench. Not because of the surprise I had suspected it since I saw those files, but hearing it confirmed by someone else hurt like the first time. "I've been with that company for almost 8 years, I said slowly. "I started as an employee and worked my way up to team lead. I've treated every project as if it were my own. And he used that very thing to get a new position somewhere else." Alex looked at me, and his voice softened. "What are you planning to do?" I didn't answer right away. I got up and walked to the window. Below, the car lights formed an endless river. There were people rushing home, others still making a living, and others, like me, standing at a crossroads, not knowing how many things they had just lost. "I've thought a lot these past 2 weeks," I said, my gaze still fixed outside. If it were just an affair, I could have signed the papers, divided the assets, and made a clean break. A one-time pain, and that's it. But this is no longer a private matter between two people. Alex didn't interrupt me, he let me finish. I can't stay silent, I continued. Not for revenge, but because if I keep quiet, the people who trusted me, my colleagues, will suffer the consequences. As I said that, I remembered the company's conference room, where I had sat countless times to defend every plan, every figure. I remembered the colleagues who had stayed up all night with me to meet deadlines, and I remembered the way Mark used to put his hand on my shoulder and say he was proud of me. It turns out some words are not said to be fulfilled, but to conceal. Alex nodded, his gaze having regained its calm. If that's your decision, I'll help you prepare everything necessary. But you have to understand that when this comes to light, it won't just be a simple warning. There could be an internal investigation and even legal consequences. I understand, I replied, and I accept that. He looked at me for a moment longer and then said, "Then tomorrow, you should meet directly with the company's management and clearly present what you have. For my part, I will simultaneously prepare the divorce petition in the most favorable way for you, including the claim for the funds Mark has improperly used." I returned to the table, picked up the cup of tea, and took a sip. It had cooled down halfway, but its bitter taste lingered. "Thank you," I said. Alex shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing my job. The hardest part falls to you." I managed a faint smile. "I've already overcome the hardest part." He didn't ask any more questions. Perhaps he understood that the hardest part is not facing the truth, but accepting it. When I left the office, I took a taxi home. The car stopped in front of the familiar apartment building. I sat for a few more seconds before getting out. The night had completely fallen. The hallway was deserted, lit only by a cold white light. I opened the door with my key. Inside, it was dark. There were no voices, no lights, no familiar smell of a home that two people once shared. I turned on the light. The space was intact, but strangely alien. The sofa was still there, the dining table too. Mark's jacket was still hanging on a chair as always, but the feeling was no longer the same. I went into the bedroom. The door was ajar, just like the day I heard them talking from outside, only this time no one was inside. I opened the closet and took out a small suitcase, not to leave, but to pack up what no longer belonged to me. I folded Mark's clothes, piece by piece, and placed them in the suitcase without hurry, without pause. There are things that seem insignificant, but only when you have to pack them away with your own hands do you realize how much they weigh. When the suitcase was full, I zipped it up. The sound echoed dryly in the silent room. I left it in a corner, looked at it for a moment, and turned away. That night, I didn't cry. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. In my mind, it was no longer the image of Lucy or the words of Mark, just a very clear feeling. It was really over. But ending is not the end. Tomorrow, I would walk into the company. Not as a betrayed wife, but as someone who had to defend what she had built for 8 years. And I knew that when that door opened, my life would take a different direction, one in which no one could trample on my trust as easily as before. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten. A new day was arriving, as normal as ever, but for me, it was the beginning of another journey. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I was in a hurry, but because I didn't want to stay in that bed any longer. There are places that were once a refuge and, after a setback, become the most suffocating spot. I went to the kitchen, heated some water, and made myself a coffee like I did every day. The aroma spread through the silent house, but this time it no longer felt familiar. Before, I used to make 2 cups every morning, one for me and one for Mark. He liked his coffee black, no sugar. Sometimes, in a rush, he would just take a sip and leave it. I would throw it out, thinking it was an insignificant detail. Now, standing alone, watching the steam rise from my cup, I saw more clearly than ever everything I had overlooked. I didn't finish the coffee. I left it and went to get dressed. I chose a light gray pantsuit, simple and clean cut. I put on light makeup and pulled my hair back. I looked in the mirror and saw my face, but my eyes were different. There was no longer doubt or expectation in them, only an almost cold lucidity. Before leaving, I stopped in the corner of the room where Mark's suitcase had been since last night. I looked at it for a moment and then dragged it to the entryway. I didn't take it out, just left it by the wall, where he would see it as soon as he walked in. Some things don't need words. Seeing them is enough. I closed the door and got into the elevator. In the enclosed space, my reflection was drawn on the stainless steel. I stood straight, my purse in my hands, and took a deep breath. From that moment on, every step I took would not just be for me, but for everything I had cared for over the years. The car dropped me off in front of the office building at 8:15 a.m. The lobby was as busy as ever, employees coming and going, greetings, the sound of turnstiles. No one knew what I was carrying inside, and I didn't want anyone to know. I went straight up to the 12th floor, where management was located. Before entering, I paused for a few seconds, adjusted the collar of my jacket, and knocked on the door. "Come in." The director's voice sounded from inside. I pushed the door open and entered. There were 3 people in the room: the chief operating officer, the head of the legal department, and the deputy director of projects. They looked at me with some surprise, as I didn't have an appointment, but they maintained a professional demeanor. "Carmen, is something wrong?" the director asked. I closed the door behind me, approached the table, set down my purse, and said slowly, "I would like to report a matter related to the security of a project." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The head of legal looked up with a more serious expression. "What is it exactly?" I took the flash drive out of my purse and placed it on the table. "I suspect there has been a leak of internal data to an outside party. The person involved is Mark." The 3 of them were silent for a few seconds, not because they didn't understand, but because they needed time to process it. The director frowned slightly. "Do you have proof?" "It's all here," I replied, including the data files, conversation histories, and some unpublished documents. The head of legal took the flash drive and connected it to her computer. The screen showed the files. She opened them, read them quickly, and paused on a list of clients. I clearly saw her expression change from doubt to tension, and finally, to gravity. "Carmen, are you sure this data comes from our internal system?" she asked. "Positive," I affirmed. "I managed that project directly. I recognize every file." The deputy director of projects placed his hands on the table, his voice growing deeper. "If this is true, it's no longer a simple breach of internal regulations." "I understand," I nodded. The director didn't speak immediately. He looked at the screen for a long time before turning to me. "Carmen, be honest. Are you involved in this in any way?" The question didn't surprise me. In a company, when a problem occurs, the person closest to the data source is always the first suspect. "No," I replied directly, "and I came here today precisely to avoid any future misunderstandings." The director looked at me for a few more seconds and then gave a slight nod. "I believe you." Just that one sentence, but I felt a lump in my throat. Sometimes, the trust of others is the only thing that keeps you standing. The head of legal turned off the screen and addressed the director. "I propose we immediately block all of Mark's access and proceed with a system audit. We need to do it now." The director nodded. "Do it, and maintain the necessary discretion." Then he turned to me. "And you, from now on, any document related to the project, you report directly to me, no intermediaries." "Understood." The meeting wasn't long, but it was enough to set everything in motion. I stood up, said my goodbyes, and left. As the door closed behind me, I let out a long sigh. The hallway was still bright. People were coming and going, but inside me, a part of the burden had been lifted. I went back to my desk. Everything was the same. The tidy desk, the computer on, the stack of files to the side. My colleagues were still laughing and talking about work. No one knew that in just one morning, a major problem had been uncovered. I sat down, turned on my computer, and saw a new email in my inbox. It was from Mark. The subject was very brief. "We need to talk." I looked at the text for a moment and opened it. "Carmen, I just got a notification that my system access has been blocked." "What did you do?" I read the message and didn't reply. I closed the email and opened another document. Some questions don't need an answer. The person who asks them eventually figures it out. Around noon, my phone vibrated. Mark's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring to the end and then answered. "What the hell did you do?" His voice on the other end sounded agitated. Gone was the calmness of the previous day. "My job," I replied. "Are you crazy? Do you know what you're doing?" "I do," I said in a firm voice. "And do you know what you've done?" There was a silence of a few seconds on the other end, and then his tone lowered. "Carmen, one thing is one thing, and another is another. Work is work. Personal is personal. Don't mix them." I let out a soft laugh. "You were the first one to mix them. You sought a better opportunity by selling the company's data." Mark couldn't respond immediately. I could clearly hear his ragged breathing through the phone. "You're ruining me," he said. "I'm not ruining anyone," I replied. "I've just stopped covering for you." The line went silent. I knew there are words that, once spoken, cannot be taken back. "I'm coming home tonight," Mark said after a while. "We need to talk." "There's no need," I replied. "Come pick up your things." "I've already packed them." "Carmen," I hung up. I placed the phone on the table and looked out the window. The midday sun wasn't scorching, but its light reflected off the buildings across the street with such intensity that I had to squint. In that light, I suddenly saw the path I was taking more clearly. It wasn't easy, it wasn't light. But it was the only one I could choose if I wanted to preserve what was left of myself. That afternoon, the company began to move quietly. Some people were called into private meetings. Some systems were audited, and Mark's name started to be mentioned with questions that were no longer simple. I didn't participate in those conversations. I stayed at my desk, continuing with my work as I did every day. There are things that, once started, no longer need you to watch. They follow their own course to the end. At the end of the day, I packed my things and prepared to leave. As I passed by the main conference room, I saw the door was ajar, and there were people inside. I didn't stop. As I left the building, the sun had already softened. The evening breeze was blowing lightly, carrying the smell of dust and the city's heat. I walked down the steps, feeling a little lighter than I had in the morning. Not because everything was over, but because I knew I had taken the first step without looking back. And I understood that from now on, each subsequent step would not be to defend myself, but to face what was to come. That evening, I arrived home earlier than usual, not because I wanted to rest, but because I knew Mark would be coming not to see me, but to pick up his things. But either way, I wanted to be there. Not to talk, but to close a chapter of my life clearly. The house was as silent as it had been in the morning. I turned on the light, left my purse on the table, and went straight to the kitchen. I made a simple dinner, a salad and some grilled chicken. Not because I still wanted to take care of someone, but because I needed a normal routine to keep from falling into a void. Just as the chicken started to sizzle in the pan, I heard the door open. The sound was familiar, but this time it brought no sense of anticipation. Mark walked in and stood in the doorway for a few seconds, as if observing if anything in the house had changed. His gaze stopped on the suitcase by the wall and then turned to me in the kitchen. There was no greeting. "You really did it," he said in a low voice. I turned off the stove and turned around. "As you can see." He came in and closed the door behind him. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a rolled-up shirt and dark pants, but his neat appearance couldn't hide the obvious exhaustion on his face. "The company is investigating me," he said. "I know. You didn't have to go this far." "I didn't do anything," I replied. "I just stopped hiding it." Mark smiled bitterly. "You've changed so fast." I looked at him and then at the suitcase. "I haven't changed. I just see everything clearly now." He fell silent. The atmosphere between us was no longer as tense as in the coffee shop, but it was heavier, like a room that has been closed for too long. "Carmen," he said quietly, "can we talk for a moment?" I didn't refuse. But I didn't invite him to sit either. I just stood there in front of him, at a distance sufficient to avoid touching. "I know I was wrong," he said. "I'm not going to justify what happened with Lucy. But could you help me out just this once with the work thing? You just have to say it was a misunderstanding, and everything will be much milder." Hearing him, I didn't feel anger, but sadness. Sadness, because even at that moment, he still thought I could go back to my old role, the one who kept quiet, to keep the peace. "Are you asking me to cover for you?" I asked. "I just need more time," he said quickly. "I have an opportunity somewhere else. If this comes out, I'll lose everything." "So, you want to take what you've stolen and leave me to deal with the consequences?" Mark frowned. "You're being too harsh." I shook my head. "I'm just telling the truth." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a slightly softer tone. "Carmen, despite everything, we were husband and wife. I don't want things to reach a point of no return." I looked at him and saw in his eyes not remorse, but worry. Worry for his job, for his future, for everything he was about to lose. "Not for me." "You're mistaken," I said slowly. "Some things were already past the point of no return long before you realized it." He stood still, and then sighed. "So, what do you want?" I didn't answer right away. I went to the table, picked up a stack of papers I had prepared that afternoon, and placed it in front of him. "This is the new draft," I said. "Read it." Mark took it and flipped through a few pages. The more he read, the darker his face became. "The house isn't divided. The car must be returned along with the portion of the money from the joint account. All the money you transferred to Lucy must be accounted for." He stopped and looked up at me. "And you're asking for additional compensation?" I'm not asking for it, I replied. I've just written down what you took. You're cornering me. I'm just stopping you from taking any more. Mark clenched the papers tightly. Carmen, if you do this, you're leaving me with no way out. I was in that position too, I said. The only difference is that I didn't have a lawyer, I wasn't prepared, and I had no one on my side. My words silenced him. I saw a flash of bewilderment on his face. It was brief, but enough to know that for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be cornered, with no options. And Lucy? He asked in a slower voice. I have nothing to discuss with her, I replied. Anything related to the money is your responsibility. You still hate her. I shook my head. No. She just has nothing to do with me anymore. My answer left him baffled. Perhaps he expected harsher words, or at least a show of anger, but by then, that feeling had passed. When something is completely broken, there's no strength left to hate. There's only a void. Mark put the papers on the table and sat down, resting his head in his hands. I never thought things would end up like this. I looked at him, not feeling much of anything. Neither did I. After a while, he looked up. If I sign, will you stop here? I'll do my part, I said. The company issue is not up to me. He smiled bitterly. So, you're just letting them deal with me. I'm not letting anyone deal with anyone, I replied. You did something, and now you face the consequences. Silence fell again. Outside the window, it was already night. The lights in the apartments across the street were coming on, one by one. Mark stood up and walked toward the suitcase. He dragged it to the center of the room, opened it, and looked inside. The clothes were folded impeccably, piece by piece, with nothing missing or extra. He stood there for a long time and then said in a low voice, You prepared this meticulously. I didn't want you to have to come back for more things. He nodded slightly. Right. A soft right, but it sounded very distant. He zipped up the suitcase and picked it up. As he reached the door, he stopped with his back to me. Carmen, he said. I didn't answer, just stood still. If you ever need help, let me know. I looked at his back and saw a man I had once trusted. Now, as strange as an old acquaintance. I don't need it anymore, I said. The door opened and closed behind him. The click of the lock was very faint, but inside me, it sounded like a definitive full stop. I stood still for a long time in the empty house. There were no more footsteps, no voices, no presence of the man who had lived with me for 3 years. It was just me and a long silence. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and ate my dinner slowly, bite by bite. The taste was the same as always, but the feeling was different. There was no one to wait for, no one to share with, but also no one to have to put up with. These small tasks helped keep my mind occupied. The night wore on. I turned off the living room lights, leaving only a dim light in the bedroom. Before going to bed, I looked around the room again. There was no suitcase, no jacket, no trace of him. I lay down, pulled the blanket over me, and closed my eyes. I no longer saw Mark's image. Just a very clear feeling. I had walked a very long road, and I had finally managed to get out of it. Tomorrow, everything would continue, but at least from today, I would no longer be dragged down by the past. And that was enough. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, not because I had more work, but because I wanted to take charge of the new day. After everything that had happened, I understood something very clearly. If I stopped, others would decide for me. The building was the same as always, bright, with people coming and going, but as I entered, I noticed a different atmosphere, something very subtle, but perceptible to someone involved. The glances of some colleagues lingered on me a little longer than usual before shifting away. No one asked anything, but I knew the rumors had started to spread. In a work environment, no secret lasts long. I went straight to my floor. As I sat down, I saw 3 new emails from the legal department and 1 from the director. The content was brief. They asked me to provide more details about the projects Mark had been involved in over the past 6 months. I opened each file and answered each question without haste, without pause, with precision and sufficiency. There were figures and dates that I used to know by heart for work, which had now become evidence. Every time I typed a line, I felt like I was closing a part of my past with my own hands. Around 9:30 a.m., the head of legal called me into a small meeting room. She and another person from the internal control department were there. They didn't beat around the bush. Carmen, she said in a serious but not aggressive tone, we've done a preliminary review. What you've provided has merit. But to be sure, we need you to confirm a few points. I nodded. Ask whatever you need. The meeting lasted almost an hour. Every detail was reviewed, every file was cross-referenced. Sometimes they asked me the same thing in different ways to check for consistency. I understood it was a necessary procedure. When we finished, the head of legal looked at me for a moment and said, "I know this isn't easy for you, but you did the right thing." I didn't answer, just gave a slight nod. There are words that, even if they sound light, are enough to help one stand firmer. When I left the room, I went back to my desk. My colleagues were still working, but the atmosphere had changed. Some looked at me with caution, others with curiosity, and some with respect. I didn't blame them. When something significant happens, people tend to observe from a distance before deciding where to position themselves. At noon, I received a message from an unknown number. "Carmen, it's Lucy. Can we meet for a moment?" I stared at the message for a long time. Her name on the screen brought back a chain of memories. From childhood days to dinners together, the times we shared secrets about family and work, and the day she showed up at my house with her suitcase. I didn't reply immediately. I put the phone down and continued working. But about 10 minutes later, a second message came. "I know you don't want to see me, but there are things I want to clarify." I looked at the screen again. Not because I wanted to hear her out, but because I understood that there are things that, if not said once and for all, remain unresolved. I replied, 3 p.m. at the usual coffee shop. She answered almost instantly. "Okay." In the afternoon, I left the office on time. On the way, I didn't think much. There are meetings you don't need to prepare for. You just need to bring clarity with you. The coffee shop was the same one from the other day, the same table, the same picture window overlooking the street, the same afternoon light falling on the table. The only difference was that this time, Mark wasn't there. Lucy had already arrived. She was sitting with her back straight and her hands in her lap, a tense expression on her face. When she saw me walk in, she stood up instinctively. "Carmen," she said in a low voice. I nodded and sat across from her. There was a silence of several seconds. The waiter came over. I ordered a glass of water. Lucy ordered a coffee, but when it arrived, she didn't touch it. "I'm so sorry, Carmen," she said in a weak voice. I didn't react. I looked out the window, where the traffic continued to flow, and then I looked back at her. "What did you want to tell me?" Lucy bit her lip, and her eyes reddened. "I know I was wrong. I have no excuse, but I don't want you to think I was like that from the beginning." "From what beginning?" I asked. "From when I moved in with you," she said quickly. "At first, I really just saw it as a temporary place. I had no intentions with Mark." I looked at her without interrupting. "But then we started talking more. He would tell me about you, how busy you were, how little you cared about the house. And I saw how lonely he was." Hearing this, I felt a shiver, not from pain, but because these excuses were so familiar, so worn out, that anyone could use them to justify their actions. "And you fell in love?" I asked. Lucy shook her head, and tears began to fall. I knew it was wrong, but at that moment, I couldn't stop. "You couldn't, or you didn't want to?" I insisted. She fell silent. I sighed softly. "You know what I can't accept? It's not that you and Mark are together. It's the way you came into my life, treating me like a sister, while you were doing all that behind my back." Lucy lowered her head, and her shoulders trembled. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. And I don't plan to forgive you," I said directly. She looked up, her eyes red. "Then why did you come today?" "To close this once and for all," I replied. "So that if we ever run into each other by chance, I won't have to avoid you or carry anything with me." Lucy looked at me with an expression of surprise that turned into sadness. "You're stronger than I thought." "I'm not strong," I said. "I just don't want to be weak anymore." Another silence. The clinking of a spoon at the next table sounded clear and sharp. "Mark. Has he said anything to you?" Lucy asked. "Yes," I replied. "He wanted me to help him cover things up with the company." Lucy froze. "Did he really say that?" "I have no reason to lie to you." She sat in silence, as if she had just realized something. "I didn't know." "I believe you," I said. "Because if you knew, you probably wouldn't be here asking me about it." Lucy managed a sad smile. "Maybe I thought he was different." "We both thought that once," I replied. That sentence left us both in silence, not because there was nothing more to say, but because everything that needed to be said had been said. I stood up first. "I'm leaving." Lucy stood up too. "Carmen, really, I'm sorry." I looked at her one last time. Her face was still the one I knew, but everything inside her had changed. "I heard you," I said. "But keep that apology for yourself." With that, I turned and left the coffee shop. The afternoon wind was blowing, bringing with it the coolness of the end of the day. I walked down the steps slowly, my heart lighter than before. There are encounters that don't make you happier, but they help you let go of baggage. And for me, that was enough. That night, I didn't go straight home. I walked for a long time along the lake in Central Park. The city was lighting up, and the lamplight reflected on the water like scattered fragments of memories. A soft, damp breeze cleared my mind after such a long day. The meeting with Lucy hadn't completely relieved me, but I no longer felt so overwhelmed. There are things that, once you hear them with your own ears and see them with your own eyes, you no longer need to imagine. And when you stop imagining, the pain lessens. I stopped by the railing, looking at the water. In that moment, I thought of my mother. I hadn't told her from the beginning, not to hide it, but because I needed to get through the first phase on my own. But now that everything was clear, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. I took out my phone and dialed her number. It rang twice, and she answered. Carmen. Her voice sounded as warm and calm as ever. Yes, Mom, it's me. You've been so busy lately. I've called you a few times, and you didn't answer. I gripped the phone. Yes, I've had things to do. My mother was silent for a moment, and then asked more gently. Is something wrong, honey? That question brought a lump to my throat. I looked at the water, trying to keep my voice normal. Mom. Mark and I are getting a divorce. On the other end, there was a silence, not of surprise, but of someone trying to understand. What happened, honey? She asked without raising her voice. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't talk about Lucy, or what I had heard and seen. I just said concisely. He has someone else. My mother sighed very faintly. I see. Just that one phrase, but in it, I heard many things. Not surprise, not blame, just a sad acceptance. Are you okay? She asked. I smiled faintly, though she couldn't see me. I'm okay. Are you really okay? She insisted. I was silent for a moment and then said, I'm starting to be. She didn't ask for more details, just said. If you're very tired, come home for a few days. That sentence made my eyes well up. I looked at the water and saw my reflection, blurry among the lights. Okay, I'll arrange it and come, I replied. Well, and whatever it is, talk to me about it. Don't keep it all to yourself. Yes, Mom. I hung up and stood there a while longer, before heading back. That night, I slept better than the previous ones, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer keeping it all to myself. The next morning, I arrived at the office as usual, but as soon as I entered the lobby, I noticed an obvious change. It wasn't just curious glances anymore, this time, there were whispers. I passed by 2 employees at the reception and overheard snippets. They say he's been suspended for something about data. And his wife works here. I didn't stop. I got into the elevator and pressed the button for my floor. In the enclosed space, I watched the numbers go up, but my heart no longer fluttered like the day before. The news was spreading. When I reached my floor, a close colleague approached me. Carmen, she said in a low voice. I stopped. Yes? She looked around and lowered her voice. They called Mark in to talk to management this morning. They say he's been suspended. I nodded. Yes, I know. She looked at me with some concern. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said. She didn't ask any more questions, just gave me a pat on the arm and went back to her desk. I sat at my desk, turned on the computer, and saw a new email. It was an internal notification, very brief. This is to inform you that Mark, an employee in the projects department, has been temporarily suspended from his duties to facilitate an internal investigation. No details, no explanations, but for those of us who worked there, it was enough. I read the email and closed it. I felt neither satisfaction nor pity. It was just another step in the chain of events that had already begun. Around noon, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother-in-law. I looked at the name on the screen, hesitated for a few seconds, and answered. Hello. Carmen. Mark just told me what you're doing. Are you out of your mind? Her voice was not warm, it was sharp and aggressive. I stood up and went into the hallway to speak more freely. We're filing for divorce. I know about the divorce, but what you did at his company. You're trying to ruin his career over a mistake? People cheat, Carmen. It's terrible, but it happens. You don't destroy someone's livelihood out of spite. That sentence left me frozen for a few seconds. Ma'am, I said slowly, I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped covering up his corporate theft. He's going to lose everything. And after all he's done for you, she raised her voice. You're being incredibly vindictive. You know we'll hire the best lawyers, right? We won't let you leave him with nothing. Hearing her, I felt an emptiness. I used to be very fond of my mother-in-law. She wasn't a difficult woman. But at that moment, I understood that this civility only existed as long as everything was calm. When problems arise, people jump to defend their own blood, no matter how wrong they are. I'm just following the law, I said calmly. I don't want to discuss this further. There were no more words on the other end. After a while, she just said, "You'll regret this." The call ended. I stood in the hallway for a moment and then went back to my desk. Everything was proceeding as normal, but inside me, the last thread that tied me to that family had broken. There were no ties left. That afternoon, I received a message from Alex. Tomorrow afternoon, Mr. Mark's side wants to meet to negotiate the agreement. Does that work for you? I read the message and replied briefly, yes. I put the phone down and looked out the window. The evening light was again bathing the buildings across the street, just like in the previous afternoons, only the Carmen of today was not the same as the one from back then. I knew that tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be easy. When a person is cornered, they try by all means to save what they have left. But this time, the one who was cornered was no longer me, and I had no intention of backing down. The next afternoon, I arrived 15 minutes early. Not out of nervousness, but because I wanted a few moments alone before the meeting. We didn't meet at the coffee shop, but in a small room in Alex's office, an enclosed, quiet space with a bright, white light that left no room for ambiguity. I sat down, placed my purse on the table, and clasped my hands. A pitcher of water and 2 files were already there. I didn't open them. I just sat there, breathing deeply to calm myself. The door opened. Alex came in first, greeting me with a nod, and behind him was Mark. Just the two of them, no Lucy. I looked at Mark and noticed the change. His shirt was no longer so pristine, his hair not so well combed. His face was visibly more gaunt. But what had changed the most was his gaze. The usual confidence was gone, replaced by a tension that was hard to hide. He sat across from me without speaking. Alex sat in the middle, opened his file, and in his usual tone, said, "Let's begin." No one objected. He pushed my draft toward Mark. "This is the agreement proposed by Mrs. Carmen. Have you read it?" Mark nodded. "Yes, I've read it. And do you have any objections?" Mark didn't answer right away. He looked at the papers and then at me. "I want to talk to you directly first," he said. "I don't object," I replied. He took a deep breath, as if gathering his strength. "I can't accept all of your conditions." "I know," I replied, "but those are my conditions. If you take everything from me, I'll have nothing left to start over." "I'm not taking anything of yours," I said slowly. "I'm just taking back what was always mine." He clenched his fist slightly. "You know that's not what I mean." "I know perfectly well." I looked at him steadily. "Do you want to keep what you stole?" My words left him without a response. Alex didn't intervene. He just let us talk, taking only a few notes from time to time. Mark continued, lowering his voice. "I don't deny I was wrong. But you should give me a way out." "I have given you one," I replied. "I haven't asked for anything that isn't backed by evidence. But you're including the transfers I made." He paused, as if weighing his words. "To Lucy." "I'm including the transfers that came out of the joint account," I said. "Who you gave them to is your business." The tension in the room increased, but it didn't explode. It was like a rope stretched to its maximum, about to break. Mark leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for a second, and then looked back at me. "Do you feel anything for me anymore?" he asked. The question didn't surprise me. It was his last attempt to drag me back into the past. "Feelings have nothing to do with this," I said. "This is a matter of what's fair. So, if I accept everything, you'll stop making things difficult for me?" "I've never made things difficult for you," I replied. "You're making things difficult for yourself." He smiled bitterly. "You talk like a lawyer." "I've learned," I said. A long silence. Then, Alex intervened. "Let me clarify a point. If you do not reach an agreement, the matter will go to court. In that case, not only the assets and finances will be reviewed, but also any conduct that constitutes a breach of marital duties. I believe you understand what that means." Mark didn't look at Alex. He kept looking at me. "Do you really want to go that far?" he asked. "If necessary," I replied. He nodded slowly, as if he had finally understood. "I need time," he said. "You've had it," I replied, "since I gave you the draft." "I need more," he insisted. "At least a week." I didn't answer right away. I looked at him and then at Alex. Prolonging this only makes sense if there is a real willingness to negotiate, Alex said. If it's just to buy time, it's unnecessary. Mark was silent for a few seconds. I'll sign, he said in a low voice. But I need to organize my finances. I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw he wasn't stalling. 3 days, I said. Not one more. He looked up. 3 days is not enough. It's enough, I replied. What you need to organize, you started doing a long time ago. My words left him frozen for a moment. I knew he understood what I meant. He had been preparing his exit for a long time, he just didn't imagine it would be like this. All right, he said, after a while. 3 days. Alex noted it down and nodded. Then it's agreed. In 3 days, both parties will sign. The meeting seemed to be over, but Mark didn't get up. He just sat there, looking at me with an expression that was hard to decipher. Carmen, he said, more slowly. If none of this had happened, do you think things would be different? I looked at him. That question wasn't meant to change the outcome, but to find an answer for himself. No, I said. He frowned slightly. Why? Because what happened wasn't an unexpected mistake, I continued. It was the result of something that already existed before. He said nothing more. He stood up, took the papers, gave a slight nod to Alex, and left. When his hand touched the doorknob, he paused for a second, but didn't turn around. The door opened and closed. The room fell silent again. I sat for a few more seconds and then let out a long sigh. Not of exhaustion, but because a moment of great tension had ended. Alex closed his file. You did very well. I smiled faintly. I just did what I had to do. He looked at me with a different expression. Not everyone would be able to. I didn't reply. I stood up and took my purse. In 3 days, I said. Yes, he nodded. I'll prepare everything. I left the office. The afternoon was mild. The sun was no longer harsh. The wind blew lightly, bringing the familiar smell of vegetation and asphalt. I stopped for a moment on the steps, watching people pass by. Life went on without stopping for anyone. Inside me, a very clear feeling began to take shape. It wasn't relief or joy, but certainty. I was reaching the end of this road, and this time, I would walk it alone to the end. 3 days later, I wasn't early or late. I arrived on time, just as I had maintained everything during my 3 years of marriage with precision, sufficiency, and without excess. Alex's office was the same as last time, the small meeting room, the long wooden table, the white light. Nothing to distract, everything was direct, like what was about to happen. Alex was already there. When he saw me enter, he greeted me with a slight nod. On the table, 2 sets of documents were prepared, one for each of us, perfectly stapled. Mark arrived about 2 minutes later. He walked in without looking around, barely greeting anyone. His gaze brushed past me very quickly, and then fixed on the file in front of him. The last 3 days hadn't been easy for him. His face was more gaunt, his eyes more sunken, but this time, his gaze no longer held a fight, only acceptance. He sat down. No one spoke immediately. The atmosphere was no longer as tense as last time, but more somber, like the calm that follows a great storm. Alex broke the silence. Today, we will proceed with the signing of the divorce agreement as agreed. I remind you once again that upon signing, all clauses will take effect. Please read it again carefully. Mark nodded. I did too. Alex opened the files and handed a copy to each of us. I turned the pages, though I had already read them countless times. The lines of black ink. The clear clauses, no emotions or memories, just demarcation. The apartment was mine. Mark would be responsible for returning the portion of the car's money that came from the joint account. The money transfers were recorded and had to be repaid in specific installments. No children in common, no other conflicts, no more ties. I stopped on the last page. The space for the signature was still blank. I placed the pen on the table without signing yet. I looked up. Mark was also looking at the last page, his hand on his pen, but not moving it. There was a silence of several seconds. No one rushed. Finally, it was Mark who spoke first. Carmen, he looked at me. When we sign, it's really over, isn't it? The question no longer had a pleading tone. It was more of a confirmation, a way of accepting what was about to happen. Yes, I replied. He nodded very slightly. I never thought this day would come, he said in a low voice. Neither did I replied. He managed a very faint smile. 3 years went by so fast. I didn't say anything. For me, 3 years had been neither fast nor slow. They had been a path with enough good things to start and enough cracks to end. I always thought that no matter what happened, you would be the one to stay until the end, he continued. I thought so too, I said. My answer silenced him. He looked at me for a moment longer and then looked down. I'm sorry, he said. This time, it wasn't a rushed apology like the previous ones. It was slow, clear, and heavy with weight. I heard him, but I didn't reply immediately. Some apologies come too late. Not because they have no meaning, but because they can no longer change anything. I heard you, I said. Just that. No reproaches, no forgiveness. Just an acknowledgement of receipt. He nodded, as if he understood. He picked up the pen. The moment the tip touched the paper, I saw his hand hesitate for an instant, an almost imperceptible, but evident movement. Then he signed. His name appeared on the paper with that familiar handwriting I had seen on so many documents, bills, and even on greeting cards from before. This time, it was in a different place, a place of closure. He put the pen down, and Alex turned to me. Mrs. Carmen. I nodded, took my pen. My hand didn't tremble. I looked at the space for the signature and wrote my name. Carmen. My handwriting was the same as always, it hadn't changed. Only the person writing it was no longer the same as 3 years ago. When I put the pen down, I didn't feel the pain I expected. There wasn't a single moment when my heart clenched, just a very clear feeling. It's over. Alex collected the 2 copies, reviewed them one last time, and stamped them. With this, everything is formalized, he said. There was no applause, no congratulations, no ceremony, just a simple sentence, but enough to close a marriage. Mark stood up first. He didn't look at me immediately. He adjusted the collar of his shirt out of habit and then turned. I'm leaving, he said. I nodded. There was no handshake, no hug, no farewell. He turned and walked out the door. This time, he didn't stop. The door opened and closed. I sat for a few more seconds, looking at the empty space in front of me. There was no one on the other side anymore. There was nothing left to say. Alex gathered the documents and put them in his briefcase. Do you need a ride home? No, that's okay, I said. I can go by myself. He nodded. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to let me know. I know. I stood up, took my purse, and left the room. The hallway outside was brighter. The natural light coming through the windows made everything sharper. I walked slowly, unhurriedly. When I reached the door of the building, I stopped for a moment, not because I didn't want to keep going, but because I wanted to remember that instant. A path had ended, with no turning back, no regrets. Only the future remained. I walked down the steps. The wind was blowing gently. The city was the same, everything was continuing its course. Only I was different. I didn't go home right away. I walked without a fixed destination, just to let my body get used to the feeling of emptiness. I went into a small coffee shop, ordered a tea, and sat alone, watching people pass by. Suddenly, I realized I no longer felt abandoned. I used to think that if I lost someone, I would lose everything. But now I understood that there are things that only truly belong to you when you dare to let go of what no longer deserves you. I took out my phone and texted my mother. It's done. My mom replied almost instantly. Good. Come home for a few days, honey. I looked at the message and smiled faintly. I'm coming. I turned off the phone and took a sip of tea. Its taste was a bit bitter at first. But it left a sweet aftertaste. Like everything I had just lived through. Lucy hadn't stolen my husband, she had only taken a man who, in reality, no longer belonged to me. And what I had managed to keep was not the assets or a job title, but myself. A person who had overcome a breakup without losing her worth. A person who knew when to stop in time and who knows how to start over without anyone else setting the path. I took a deep breath, feeling the morning air fill my lungs, and went back inside. Life went on, and this time, I was walking forward without looking back.